Sam knows fairly well. Very similar. Yeah, I know he's right. We're okay. We're okay. We're okay. So, good morning. We are here this morning to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Mastroianni. I'm in trouble here if I go on and on and on about Dr. Mastroianni, but most of you in the audience have never met him. So I want to take a few minutes to review with him his career and how much he meant to this department. So these are a number of pictures of Dr. Mastroianni through his career. And this is when he came, during his chairmanship at Penn. This is from 1985. He came in the mid-60s to become chairman of OBGYN at the University of Pennsylvania. You can see him back here, one of the younger guys under Dr. Stemler, who was the dean at the time. And this was the group that did a lot of great things. And he brought with him Dr. Garcia, and the two of them, along with Dr. Wallach, they set up this academic department and set it apart from just being a clinical department to being a truly academic department with a very strong research mission. They even had a monkey colony here, and this is Dr. Wallach and Dr. Garcia. This was actually part of the card they gave Dr. Mastroianni, wishing him happy birthday, and this is one of the monkeys. And at that time, believe it or not, all of them were smoking pipes, and some in the offices and so on, in the hospital, believe it or not. And here is Dr. Mastroianni with one of his monkeys in the laboratory. And Penn had one of the earliest IVF programs, and this was actually the IVF team. And I'm showing this for some tribute to Dr. Turek, but also to point out Dr. Jerry Strauss, who is coming back actually after being dean at VCU for the past, 10, 12 years. He's coming back this coming summer. And this is Dr. Mastroianni in his relaxing time on his sailboat. So he made the huge difference in what OBGYN is at Penn, and this was just a taste of him at Penn. But here we are today to also honor Dr. Adashi. He is one of the biggest names in our field. He has contributed in many aspects and continues to contribute now with publications in the New England Journal and JAMA and so on, even to this day. Dr. Adashi came here from Missouri. He went to Sackler Medical School. He came to train in OBGYN at Tufts, followed by postdoc fellowships at Hopkins with Dr. Howard Jones, and then with Sam Yen at the University of California in San Diego. And then he established his academic career in Maryland, moved on to become chair at the University of Utah, and eventually became dean at Brown University, where he stepped down about 6-8 years ago. And he's probably having the greatest time of his life right now, because he's truly an academic, researching things and writing. I can't believe how much he's writing. He's publishing, well, not more than he used to. This is his CV. It's over 500 publications here, so it's quite something. And he's been honored a lot. I want to tell you, this picture here that you see, it's all out of focus, but the reason I put it there is you see how he's sort of touching his chin here. That's exactly how he was when he was my examiner in the oral boards. And he would ask me these questions and like looking blank. I said, oh my God, quite embarrassing with my answers. But anyway, so he was on the board. He was chair of the board. He was president of SREI, president of AGOS, president of SGI, and I can go on and on and on. He's also an elected member since the late 90s of the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine. So, Ellie, I know you've been here before, but we honor you again as the Mastroianni lecturers. Thank you so much for coming. Dr. Adashi.
Thank you, Christus, Dr. Driscoll, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I couldn't be more pleased to have this opportunity to recognize, celebrate, and honor the legacy of Dr. Mastroianni. I first became aware of Dr. Mastroianni in 1974 when his image graced the front page of the so-called clinician series, which is no more, but was a wonderful publication that I hold on to this day, as you can tell. Since that time, of course, I've met with Dr. Mastroianni on multiple occasions and was thoroughly impressed over the years by many of his accomplishments. I had the privilege of recruiting some of his graduating fellows over the years who joined me in practice, and all in all, I would say that the large footprint that Dr. Mastroianni left on the field of reproductive medicine is substantial, undeniable, and most importantly, lasting. With your permission, I would like to share with you, in the interest of time, just a brief episode, one episode from Dr. Mastroianni's life that is offered in the spirit of the more things change, the more they are the same. And I'm referring to the one time that Dr. Mastroianni was invited to testify before a Senate committee that at the time was preoccupied by the issue of population crisis. The year was 1966. Mind you, Dr. Mastroianni at the time was all of 41 years of age, barely into his tenure as the chair of this department. 1966 is also about a year away from Griswold v. Connecticut, when the Supreme Court legalized contraception for married women, and about 6 years away from Roe v. Wade, when the Supreme Court legalized abortion. Dr. Mastroianni was in good company in that the chair of the Senate committee invited 4 Nobel laureates to join the podium with him. Second from left is Dr. Edward Tatum, who you may recall received his Nobel Prize in 1958 for the so-called one gene, one protein hypothesis. In his prepared remarks, Dr. Mastroianni described the results of a paper of his, which was published on the pages of the Gray Journal in 1965, wherein he investigated the mechanism of action of IUDs in the non-human primate. And based on the strength of those observations, he stated at the committee that there is no justification on the basis of available evidence to date for the view that the intrauterine device is an abortifacient. We need go no further than the multiple challenges to the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act to realize that we are having still the very same debate. In the freewheeling question and answer period that followed, the chair of the committee, Senator Greening, a Democrat from Alaska, and a non-practicing physician, asked Dr. Mastroianni, do you consider the rhythm method to be an effective method of contraception? To which Dr. Mastroianni retorted, I wish I could say that the rhythm method is an effective method. There isn't one whit of evidence, however, that it is. Tell that to the present-day Department of Health and Human Services, that is once again promoting natural family planning and abstinence as leading methods of birth control. Lastly, Dr. Greening asked Dr. Mastroianni, "You are familiar, of course, with the work of Dr. Rock," to which Dr. Mastroianni responded, "Yes, indeed." The senator went on to say, "The pill which he devised seems to be increasingly used by people regardless of religious affiliation. Has that been your experience?" And Dr. Mastroianni responded, "Yes, it has. I worked with Dr. Rock in 1954, and this was at a time when the first pills were being given to the first small group of patients. They were infertility patients, and he was assessing the effect of the pill on the physiology of reproduction in this group. The pill is certainly a major breakthrough, and I believe it does allow expansion of family planning programs in a very real way. Without the pill and without the recently developed or recently modified intrauterine contraceptive device, we would have great difficulty expanding our family planning programs." The more things change, the more they stay the same. Which brings us to today's conversation on the polycystic ovary syndrome and to the delicate interrelationship between the hypothalamus and the ovary as potential culprits of this disorder. With your permission, I will retrace the history of PCO over the last 150 years, dividing my presentation into the descriptive era, the endocrine era, the metabolic era, and then concluding with the genetic or genomic era. The proximate book stand for PCOS is really the year 1844, when the French physician and historian Achille Cherot published his well-known treatise, Diseases of the Ovaries. In that contribution, Professor Cherot stated that in his opinion, PCOS represented a case of acute ovariitis of the first degree. And he went on to say that the ovaries are enlarged in volume with smooth and shiny surfaces containing many small cysts that are located on the periphery of the organ. It really doesn't get much better than that. Professor Cherot was not alone in promoting the so-called ovarian inflammation hypothesis. He was in fact strongly supported by many luminaries of his day, including Rokitansky, Virchow, and Pfannenstiel, to name a few. In the context, we have also learned that PCOS comprises an expanded stromal compartment and that it may be associated with amenorrhea and consequently with infertility. Yet others offered competing hypotheses, more of a mechanical nature. Leading that pack was Albert Goldspawn, who was a Chicago-based gynecologist, in whose view PCOS was entirely attributable to uterine retroversion and the vascular congestion that follows in its wake. Yet another Chicago-based gynecologist, Clarence Hyde, felt that the problem was all about obstructed ovulation, which is to say that the leading follicle was simply incapable of penetrating the thickened tunica albuginea. And so as we look at the state of our knowledge of PCOS in 1900, the turn of that century, we can state with some degree of confidence that the histopathology was known, the clinical presentation was partially known, perhaps with the exception of hyperinsulinemic hyperandrogenism, and that the sole remedy was ovarian wedge resection. It's not universally recognized that wedge resection was practiced well before the turn of the century, and certainly long before Stein and Leventhal made it a household name. In fact, Dr. Findley, another Chicago-based gynecologist, described a total of 180 cases in this paper that he read to the Chicago Gynecological Society in 1904. Which brings us to the endocrine era, which I would say improbably and perhaps even counterintuitively began with a so-called Stein-Leventhal report, which saw press in 1935 on the pages of the Gray Journal. Dr. Stein and Dr. Leventhal were partners in private practice of obstetrics and gynecology at the Michael Reese Hospital, a Northwestern affiliate, which, by the by, is no more. Dr. Stein and Leventhal described essentially 7 women who were suffering from amenorrhea, hirsutism, and infertility, whose ovaries were 2 to 4 times the normal size and whose ovarian cortex was hypertrophied with a thickened tunica. The mention of hirsutism was of interest in that, by and large, up to that point, that facet of the syndrome was not widely appreciated. And I would argue that from that point on, we all, I think, understood that this is part and parcel of the total package. But more importantly, Stein and Leventhal added that bilateral polycystic ovaries are probably the result of hormonal influences that are related to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. These key words, hormonal and anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, are, to my mind, the words that ushered in the endocrine era of PCOS, which up to that point was largely viewed as some mechanical disorder of one nature or another. About a quarter of a century elapsed with very little activity, in all likelihood or in large measure because the Second World War, of course, intervened. But in 1957, the thread was picked up again, and from unexpected quarters. A group from the University of Iowa, led by Dr. Kittel, who was the chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Iowa, and mentor to luminaries such as Roy Pitkin and Jim Scott, described 13 women who were afflicted with what they called wedge-resistant PCOS, which is to say, women who were subjected to wedge resection, but for one reason or another failed to resume ovulation, let alone conception. This little-known paper was a heroic type of experiment which could not, would not, should not have been done today, but nevertheless treated us, first of all, to the first description of what is a cardinal feature of PCOS, ovarian hypersensitivity to gonadotropin therapy. And when I say gonadotropins, I don't mean human gonadotropins. I mean ovine and porcine gonadotropins, since we are still 13 years away from the FDA approving the first human gonadotropic preparation. They also treated us to the first description of the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, and also to the first documentation of elevated urinary bioassayable LH, the so-called inappropriate LH to FSH ratio, which was confirmed a year later by Janet Ward MacArthur from the Massachusetts General Hospital. That same year, Carl Gemzell of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden reported the first successful induction of ovulation in PCOS with human pituitary FSH of cadaveric origin. As he put it, following the hormonal treatment, the endometrium showed a secretory reaction. Urinary excretion of pregnenolone, but not of estrogen, increased. In the left ovary, a fresh ovulation was seen. Only 3 years later, Robert Greenblatt, then with the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, reported on the successful induction of ovulation in 8 of 9 women with PCOS using clomiphene citrate, which at the time was still known by its code name MRL/41. Clomiphene citrate would not be approved for widespread clinical use until 6 years later in 1967. About 3 years after that, Bill Dignam from UCLA provided the first biochemical evidence of hyperandrogenism in PCOS in this paper, which saw press in Acta Endocrinologica, a finding which was confirmed and expanded by a power team from the NIH, which went as far as to measure testosterone production rates, not simply steady-state levels of circulating testosterone. I would be remiss if I didn't close this chapter of the discussion with a paper by Sam Yen, wherein the so-called inappropriate LH to FSH ratio notion was first driven home. In that paper, which relied on newly available radioimmunoassays for human LH and FSH, unheard of prior to that time, Dr. Yen documented clearly the relative elevation of LH relative to FSH in women with PCOS. Dr. Yen at the time was at Case Western Reserve, and as he intimated to me later in his life, he said that these studies were carried out in his private office of obstetrics and gynecology at the McDonald House, and that he, in his words, converted it into a clinical research center. As we approach the year 1970, now 70 years after the turn of the century, we can state that the histopathology is of course known, that the clinical presentation comprises chronic anovulation and consequent infertility and hirsutism, the biochemical correlates of which were inappropriate LH to FSH and hyperandrogenism, at which point the sole remedy being ovulation induction rather than retrosection, and by that I mean either with gonadotropins or with clomiphene citrate, although clomiphene citrate, as you may know, has recently been dethroned in this context by letrozole, which would be the appropriate drug to use in 2018. Which brings us to the metabolic era, which began, again, somewhat inconspicuously and unexpectedly from a contribution that was made by essentially the pediatric and adult endocrine divisions of the University of Tennessee in Memphis. The main protagonists, I would argue, were Jim Givens and Abbas Kitabchi, both of whom, regrettably, are no longer with us, but who unequivocally documented a direct relationship between the circulating levels of insulin on the one hand and the levels of androgen on the other. And this opened up a whole new era of studies that attempted to address the complicated etiologic cause and effect relationship between insulin resistance and compensatory hyperinsulinemia on the one hand and ovarian hyperandrogenism on the other. We could reformulate this or restate the same in two questions. The first being, does insulin promote ovarian androgen biosynthesis? Alternatively, do androgens promote an insulin-resistant state and thereby compensatory hyperinsulinemia? The first question was definitely and unequivocally settled by a group from the NIH led by Jesse Roth, which in a number of important papers have clearly documented that insulin resistance, whether of immune origin or of genetic origin, is associated, of course, with compensatory hyperinsulinemia, but in most cases, especially in premenopausal women, was associated with ovarian hyperandrogenism. Any residual doubts were put to rest by some in vitro work by Eleuterio Hernandez and others, who by adding insulin to cultured ovarian cells have demonstrated an increase in LH-stimulated androgen biosynthesis, with insulin likely acting as a co-gonadotropin. In vivo, John Nestler and associates on the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine have demonstrated that the reverse would work as well. If you decrease the serum levels of insulin with metformin, you reduce ovarian androgen biosynthesis. The other questions that I formulated earlier, do androgens promote an insulin-resistant state, unfortunately remains somewhat unsettled. And that is because a group of papers which I'm listing here, wherein androgen economy was manipulated in a variety of ways, did not observe a change in insulin resistance. Another group of papers which relied pretty much on the same manipulation of androgen economy did notice a change in insulin resistance. To this day, we really do not have a satisfactory resolution of this particular question. Which brings us to the genetic or genomic era, which, like many of the eras we discussed today, began from unexpected quarters with a little-known publication that hails from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Minnesota. You may recognize at least two of the co-authors, Dr. Conald Prem, who was an oncologist, later on became the chair of the department, and Bill Spelsey, a very distinguished member of our discipline, who headed several departments and ended his career in Tampa, Florida. If there was a significant contribution made here, it was that for the first time in the literature, PCOS was considered a heritable disorder, or at least consideration was given to the possibility that PCOS had a genetic backdrop. These authors presumed that they were dealing with an autosomal dominant trait. That's not so clear whether or not that still is the case. In fact, we are in the dark as far as the genetics of PCOS. But if nothing else, they put on a map a whole new field of interest, and that is the genetics of PCOS. At the very least, a whole host of familial clustering studies followed, none of which was conclusive or final, but really engendered a lot of interest and enthusiasm in the possibility that there is a genetic backdrop here. As the technology progressed, we of course moved from familial clustering studies to candidate gene association studies, and there must have been some 70 papers or so that were published using this approach in an effort to uncover potential culprits for PCOS. The downside of this approach, as you may know, is that it is hypothesis dependent and that it's relatively difficult to assemble a meaningful number of patients. There are just not all that many patients around. When technology progressed further, of course, we switched to genome-wide association studies, the strength of which is that it is hypothesis independent, But on the other hand, it generates so many susceptibility loci candidates that the workup of which is anything but trivial. The first such study saw press in 2011 in Nature Genetics and identified 3 susceptibility loci, one of which, the LH-HCG receptor, was of course ovary specific. Another one, DENT1A, just make a note of because I'll come back to it in just a minute. A year later, another paper in Nature Genetics added 8 additional susceptibility loci, some of which, such as the FSH receptor, yet again were relatively FSH specific in that we now know that FSH receptors exist in bone as well as in fat tissue, but at the time was thought of primarily as an ovary-specific gene. And there were several other interesting findings, such as the insulin receptor as a susceptibility loci, which resonated with all of those who were interested in hyperinsulinemic hyperandrogenism. And since all of these studies were carried out on Chinese populations, they were confirmed later on cohorts of European ancestry by 2 investigators who published 2 papers in 2012. Coming back now to DENT1A, just to illustrate the workup of these various susceptibility loci, I'd like to briefly go over a paper first authored by Jan McAllister and senior authored by Jerry Strauss, which was published in 2013 in PNAS. In the first set of experiments, the investigators simply measured the levels of DENT1A transcripts and protein and compared those in PCOS theca cells versus normal cells and found that the levels are much higher in the PCOS theca cells. In a second set of experiments, they proceeded to overexpress DENT1A in normal theca and in so doing converted it into a PCOS-like theca, wherein steroidogenic enzyme activity was much increased and androgen biosynthesis was markedly enhanced. Finally, they did the reverse experiment. They knocked down DEN1A in PCOS theca and were able to show that that cell now was converted more into a normal phenotype with modest activity of gene transcription of certain steroidogenic enzymes and reduced androgen biosynthesis. None of this, of course, proves cause and effect and/or etiologic origins, but it's part of a very broad effort to figure out what in the world is actually underlying this disease we've been struggling with, at the very least, for 150 years, although possibilities are that some forms of this were dealt with earlier. Some of that genetic confusion, if you will, was commented on by Ricardo Aziz in 2016 in Nature Reviews Endocrinology, wherein he stated, as a highly prevalent disorder that is associated with reduced fertility, PCOS seems to represent an evolutionary paradox. And I believe what he was trying to say is that to the extent that PCOS is as old as humanity, and to the extent that we assume that we acquire that mutations somewhere along the way, what is it about that mutation that provides a selective evolutionary advantage for us to hold on to it, even though it compromises fertility, it produces all kinds of adverse metabolic consequences, and we can hardly think of a positive thing to say about PCOS. And yet, it is at least possible that somewhere there is harbored an evolutionary advantage, the nature of which remains to be established. In closing, I would like to go relatively quickly over the complicated and unresolved question of the hypothalamus versus the ovary as the drivers of PCOS. I could reformulate this to read, is PCOS a primary hypothalamic disorder? In other words, is the seat of the pathology, the hypothalamus, and the ovary is just an innocent bystander. And there is evidence to support this notion. In 1981, Quigley from UCSD reported decreased central, presumably arcuate dopaminergic tone in patients with PCOS. He went as far as to say, is PCO the reproductive equivalent of Parkinson's disease? In 1983, Barnett Zumov from Albert Einstein reported on the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine disordered chronobiology of GnRH release in women with PCOS. He went on to say, CNS is the probable primary locus of the pathophysiology of PCOS. Several neuroendocrine authorities over the years have observed disordered frequency of pulsatile GnRH release as well as disordered amplitude of pulsatile GnRH release in PCOS. And we knew since 1976, thanks to the work of Dr. Rebar, that the pituitary was hypersensitive to GnRH in patients with PCOS. But we cannot ignore the opposite possibility, and that is PCOS a primary ovarian disorder, which is to say the culprit is the ovary and the hypothalamus is collateral damage. And there's evidence to support that. There exists a so-called PCOS sonotype in so-called normal women, and by that I mean normally cycling women, who, by the by, are hypersensitive to exogenous gonadotropin therapy, even though they don't have frank PCOS. Second, the cardinal feature of PCOS, that is to say the hypersensitivity to exogenous gonadotropins, can be maintained after prolonged periods of deprivation from gonadotropins, whether because of prolonged provision of a GnRH agonist or in the context of prolonged hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. Both have been described, reported, and published. And of course, let us not forget that at least some of the susceptibility loci that have been identified are indeed ovary-specific. And so we cannot quite dismiss in any meaningful way either theory at this point in time. Which leaves us with the unsatisfactory situation that I refer to here as the going around the squirrel conundrum, which was formulated by and for the American philosopher William James. Seems James heard a squirrel scratching on the unseen side of a tree. James circled to his right, and the squirrel did as well. No matter how quickly James moved, the squirrel moved just as quickly and thus remained unseen. It seems that we, that is to say the collective we, are doomed to miss that squirrel for some time to come. But I do hope that if we all hang around long enough, I might be here for a repeat visit in a decade or two to report to you a sighting of the squirrel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie.
Question. It was great. I'd like to hear another hour talk. I could sit here all day listening to you. One thing that you didn't really talk about, and it's sort of fun to think about, what is your idea of what is the advantage of PCOS, is the idea of obesity. You didn't mention obesity at all in your talk. And I think we've all seen just a lot of South Asian who gained weight here in the United States and then seem to have PCOS. Any thoughts about that?
No, I mean, not terribly useful ones anyway, in the sense that I was never fully convinced that overweight is an essential piece of the puzzle, meaning there are patients who are lean and display many of the features of PCOS. I never was an expert or highly published author in the area, so I'm not speaking perhaps with authority, but from my clinical experience and my readings, I never was fully convinced of the indispensability or the inseparability of the overweight issue. The other thing I would say is we're branching out even as we speak. There's a group or two who are pointing out, I think with some merit, the fact that there are cases of hypoandrogenic PCOS as well. And so to what degree are these classic symptoms, as we refer to them, indispensable or somehow unassailable, I think is always somewhat an open question in my mind. I think clearly the conventional wisdom is that many, maybe most of these women may be coping with overweight. But I've never was fully convinced that that was invariant in some fashion. Please.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So in the conundrum between the hypothalamus and the ovary, just because we have our residents and fellows here, could you mention a little bit about anti-Müllerian hormone and how its presence now in the ovary and some of the newer studies relating to its relationship with the hypothalamus might play into this or add more?
Yes. Well, I think it's mostly has been, I think, shall we say, an informational tool. It was helpful to us, I think, to have it as a marker. But I read that literature again in preparation for this visit, and I couldn't quite plug it into the pathophysiology. I mean, I think it's a perfectly legitimate marker, one that can and should be used, but I could not quite attach an etiologic significance to it. It's an important addition to our ability to monitor these patients and others, but I didn't see any compelling studies that have actually taken that particular marker and educated us on the origins of the disease. So that was my take on it. But I always stand to be corrected. Please.
Thank you for giving us some context of the history. I remember hearing Dr. Rebar talk about how hearing about Dr. Yen's studies in the middle of the night with these hormone assays, and it was nice to actually see how that was placed in context with our understanding of PCOS. One of the things, you've seen this evolve, and I feel like you've talked about the genomic era, and now there are so many new tools, that new toys to explore. There's genomics, proteomics, metabolomics. I just wanted you to look in your crystal ball and tell us, do you see one of these having a lot of potential or something that really excites you and interests you in terms of PCOS?
I wish I could, Kate. I mean, I really don't. I mean, I was trying to be true to what I think the literature is currently offering. I think we are in a bind. We have a set of observations that have clearly matured and improved, but I don't think we have a unifying hypothesis, and I think that's what still plagues us. Does it matter in terms of How we can help these women? No. I think we can help them with their ovulatory status. We can probably help them with their weight issues. We can help them with their hyperandrogenism. We have the tools to symptomatically address the symptoms that they manifest. But we really do not have a way of getting at the root of it all. And I think that's what's still missing. I guess by and large, in our discipline, there are a few resistant entities that have so far defied definition. And in our field, PCOS is probably leading the pack. I suspect preeclampsia would be another candidate for those plaques that are currently void and await for the discoverer. There are probably others. So despite a long history, this one has yet to be cracked. And I'm not sure where that will come from. I really wish I could say, but I'm stumped.
But do you think that maybe it's because it's multiple diseases that, at least with our
Very possible.
limitations today, we think it's only
Yes,
one?
very possible. But as we stand here today and we say, what could we do to improve the state of affairs? How could we look at it differently, dissect it out differently, apply different technologies? I mean, as you have seen, we have, by and large, I think, subjected this entity to the latest technology. So, hard to say. 5 years ago, we didn't hear the word CRISPR. Tomorrow, we might hear a new word that 5 years from now would be a household word and would, in fact, crack this wide open. And we're waiting for that sort of random development that will really help us resolve this. There doesn't seem to be a clear, rational path that we could now offer or write into a grant as to how we can advance the field, or at least I cannot think of a straightforward way to do this. And that means we are temporarily out of ideas. And we are largely in the descriptive arena rather than in the mechanistic arena at this point. Thank goodness we know what we need to do when faced with such patients, because that is really ultimately what matters. But as physicians and scientists, I think we all always want to also understand where it's coming from. Just imagine having to deal with sickle cell disease, let's say, and not know what it is due to. Well, we don't have to worry about that. We have a good sense of how that's happening. Yes, we do know how to deal with it, but we can sleep well at night because we have some sense of how it comes about. We can't say that about PCOS, and that's frustrating. But it's a reality, and that's where we are in 2018, it seems to me.
Another question. Ellie, can't thank you enough.
My pleasure.
I have never heard of going all the way release here, Stein level. This is great. This is great.
Maybe I should write this. Hello.
Hi, I'm Liz Rubin. But you, I would just find out
As soon as I have it.
Who are your parents?
no, unless you haven't